environmental advocate, a scientist, and a natural resource governance and management expert. Her experience spans 15 years in the development and conservation sectors, and Nancy is inspired by working with communities who are custodians of our natural resources. And last but not least, Professor Charles Musyoki. He is the Director of Wildlife and Community Services at the Kenya Wildlife Service. He is a trained conservation scientist and manager with over 30 years of service with KWS. His experience cuts across leadership, administration, management, coordination of programs, research, ecological monitoring, single-species strategic planning, also management and formulation, and the social human dimension of conservation. So let's have a round of applause and encouragement for my wonderful panel. Karibu to you all. Welcome. Now, the topic of conversation for this panel is harnessing nature. Solutions for biodiversity conservation and climate resilience, protecting biodiversity hotspots, and strategies for sustainable conservation. I would like to set the scene to first understand the why. Why is this so important? Why is this topic critical when we think about climate change and how to fix our problems? Nancy, I'll begin with you. From the perspective of AWF, that is an NGO that advocates for the protection of wildlife, and one that works to do so as well through public policy and partnerships and actually working on the ground. Explain from that perspective why in the first place we need to protect our wildlife. Why does it matter? And I ask this question because there are a lot of people out there who are very disconnected. You might live on the outskirts of the Masai Mara, but you've never actually had the opportunity to go in and see a lion. You might live by the beach, but you've never had the opportunity to snorkel and have a look at this incredible marine wildlife, yet it impacts our lives. So let's begin with why our wildlife matters. Oh, can we get a microphone, perhaps? Oh, I think it's beside you. Is it beside you?
Is it on?
Yes.
Thank you, and a very good morning. Thank you, Smriti. I think that is a question we are always asking ourselves. Why? Why does it even matter? And I'm sure there are quite a number of believers in this room, whether you are Muslim or Christian. And a number of us, even in this country where we say we are 80 or 90% religious, still think it doesn't matter. Maybe we should go and read the book of Genesis chapter 2, where the first duty of man was to tend the earth, to take care of it. So if you have no other business, but you hope one day to find yourself in that place we say Binguni Nimbali, I think you just have to mind about this. However, and I think I want to borrow from what the DG of KWS said, even where we are seated today, even if we had no wildlife in this park, it would still be important if we are to breathe and if we are to have clean water. It would still matter. So it's not about the wildlife itself. It is the services that come from that wildlife. And we cannot survive without that. I often say, you know, we look at conservation and that whole conservation business as what we do when you have sorted out all your other basic needs. And we forget that that is actually the basic need. Dead people don't need jobs. Dead people don't need housing. Dead people don't need to vote. We need to be alive. And we were just thinking, even as we were looking, you know, at the videos that were shared, just something that all of us identify with. The water resources. So we may say we are not concerned about that. And I did the calculation, as they said, there's a woman who has said they pay 10 shillings for a 20 jerrycan of water. That comes to 500 shillings for a cubic meter of water, for which many of us in this city pay 120 shillings and 200 shillings. So that village woman pays 500 shillings. Poverty is actually expensive. And I don't think there's anything as poor as being water poor. So not only don't you have the water, so the issue of the natural resources, where they sit, the wildlife, the flora, the fauna, that whole combination. It's not whether we want to take care of it, is whether we want to survive. And therefore at AWF what we look at is, it's not do we conserve or do we develop? It is not a dichotomy. We must conserve if we must develop. So we have no choice. So if we need to develop, if we need ecological infrastructure, if we need, for those of us in this city again and many other cities where we use borehole water, for that water to be recharged, we need these open spaces. So we can't say we shall provide water and not be thinking about the spaces where that water is. So it is not whether, it is we must. And therefore we have no choice. And even if you don't like conservationists, because they are tree huggers, as they are called, it is about us, it's about the clean air, it's about the clean water, it's the ecosystem services provided. And if you forget the why, forget the elephant and the rhino, which we like very much. I think our logo is the elephant, and I'm sure Charles likes the elephants very much. Forget the elephant, forget the rhino, but you need water and you need clean air. And these animals are where these services are being found. So that is the why.
Nancy, I'm going to ask you to delve in a little bit deeper and create that connection, because there might be some people here or some people watching who still don't understand how is the protection of those resources impacting my life. You know, take us through that, that link between the wildlife, the bigger picture, and how ultimately we all need each other to survive and thrive.
Yeah, thank you again. And I don't want to talk about the elephant. I'll talk about the bee, because we are always thinking the big ones. Unless we have a way of pollinating the crops the food that we are growing, if the scientists have found a way of pollinating that, which I haven't found yet, we still need those pollinators. It's the bee, it is the butterfly, and it is those that thrive when the biodiversity has been taken care of. When we pollute from pollutions, when we pollute from pesticides, when we pollute from herbicides, what we are actually doing is killing the pollinators that give us the food that we eat. So it's about your food. It's not about the rhino and how beautiful it is. It's actually about the food that we eat. And again, I say, the moment the scientists, I am one, help us to drink sand, you know, when we move from drinking water and innovate something else to drink, then we can stop caring about those small things that we care about. So it's the food, it is the water that we drink, it is the air that we have. And I think, you know, this beautiful piece of the park where we are today, being that carbon sink for Nairobi, as I've said, even if all the lions disappeared, we would still need to have this as an open park. So it matters for you, and it is not what we do once we have sorted out the other issues. It is what you wake up to do every day. Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy. Now, of course, we are all responsible for conserving, but the KWS is the government agency that is responsible for all wildlife. And when we talk about wildlife, as Nancy has said, we are not just talking about the leopards and the cheetahs, but we're talking about the insects as well, the butterflies and the bees and even the caterpillars. So Charles, climate change is undoubtedly having a devastating impact on our wildlife countrywide. I'd like you to paint a picture of the reality on the ground. What is it that we're seeing at the moment?
All right, thank you very much, Smilty. First, I want to begin by saying a very big thank you to the Nation Media Group for organizing this Earthwise Summit 2024. Secondly, for having Nairobi National Park as the venue for this summit, and thirdly, for inviting us to speak at this very important summit. Our wildlife protected areas have not been spared the effects of climate change. We have noticed over the years that our climate, our weather patterns have changed in a very dramatic and significant way. We are seeing very prolonged dry seasons. We are seeing very prolonged wet seasons. We've seen in many of our protected areas, rivers that were initially permanent becoming seasonal, flowing for a short period, and then stopping flowing completely. We've also seen a situation in our parks where water availability for the wildlife has also become quite limited compared to periods in the past when water was available practically throughout the year. We've also seen a situation where food availability for wildlife has also become very, very scanty, very scarce, again, because of the effects of climate change. And this has come about with certain unfortunate incidents. We've had quite a bit of mortalities, wildlife mortalities, because one of either the very, very prolonged droughts that then lead to a shortage of food, or a shortage of water, and this then results in some wild animals succumbing as a result of poor nutrition and then diseases that come in to kill them opportunistically. We have also seen during the very, very extreme wet seasons, wild animals that have also drowned, either in the rivers or in the water ponds, in the dams and so on, again resulting in quite a bit of wildlife mortality. So, Smilty, the effects of climate change have been quite severe for us in the wildlife sector, and we have been monitoring this situation to really see what it is that can be done to try and mitigate or adapt to this without having as big effects as this is having. We've had to actually, in some instances, to supplement the animals with food.
And that was right here in the Nairobi National Park, wasn't it? Something that the KWS never does. You never interfere with the natural cycle. But during a recent drought, you had to. Explain.
Absolutely. Just to give the animals a chance to cross over to the next good season. We did it here in Nairobi National Park, and we also did it in Tsavo, particularly for the hippos in the Mzima Springs area. So again, that's to just try and help the animals because we know a good season is going to come. So we try and make sure that they survive to reach the next good season. So these are interventions that we have had to do. We've also been very active in sinking boreholes, creating additional watering areas for these animals within the protected areas so that we can then assure them of a year-round supply of water despite the effects of climate change. So indeed, it's tough on the animals. It's even more difficult in our parks that are in the savanna areas. The savanna are the more dry areas of the country. Parks like Nairobi is in the savanna, Tsavo is in the savannas, and so those tend to be the most affected by the effects of climate change. The parks that in the mountainous areas like the Aberdare, Mount Kenya, Mount Elgon, seem to be a bit resilient in the way in which they are able then to survive the effects of climate change. Not that they are not affected, they are affected. Mount Kenya, for instance, we have been monitoring one particular glacier for the last 30 years, and we have seen a continuous shrinkage of that glacier over the years at a speed of, I think, 2 meters per year, 2 centimeters per year, which is quite significant when it comes to glaciers. So we are indeed concerned, and it's something that should concern every Kenyan, that the effects of climate change are really having a huge effect on the wildlife resource, as it were.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So the reality is that as a result of climate change, we are losing wildlife. Now, with the lack of food sources in certain areas and with habitat loss as a result of climate change, what is the knock-on effect on the connection between humans and wildlife? Wildlife is now roaming out of protected areas. in search of food. And this, no doubt, is creating conflict between humans and wildlife. Just take us through that briefly.
All right, thanks a lot. Of course, it happens either way. When we have extreme dry conditions, the animals do leave the parks in search of pastures and in search of water. And in the course of doing so, then they encounter human settlements, human activities, and then what ensues is a very severe conflict between the needs of people and the needs of the wildlife. It also happens during the wet seasons, especially when we have very extreme wet seasons. We also see a movement of animals outside of the parks into settled areas, and this also results in human wildlife conflict. So indeed, we've seen climate change then is actually a factor when it comes to the conflict between people and wildlife. And this has then made us really rethink our whole strategy and approach to dealing with human-wildlife conflict, because we've got then to be very, very alert during the extreme dry seasons and the very extreme wet seasons, because that's when we expect these animals are going to be moving out of the parks. One of the strategies that we put in place, first of all, is to fence quite a number of our parks. It may not be the best option for ecology, like Nancy has explained, but for purposes of protecting people and their property, we have gotten into a very aggressive program of fencing many of our protected areas so that we are then able to contain the animals within these protected areas and ensure that there is coexistence between people and these animals. In fact, the longest electric fence in the world is actually around one of our protected areas, which is the Aberdare, that has an electric fence that is 400 meters in length. And that makes it the longest electric fence in the world. And we have Nairobi, has a fence around it. Savo has sections of it with a fence. Lake Nakuru is completely fenced.
Allow me to interject and ask, whilst that is a partial solution, it is not an ideal solution, is it? Because fencing also blocks migratory routes, doesn't it? So whilst we might be thinking that, all right, well, then there is a solution to climate change, it is not ideal, but it's something that perhaps you've been forced to consider. All right, thank you so much, Charles. I want to shift focus now to the oceans, because whilst we focus so much on terrestrial landscapes and how they're affected by climate change and people, the oceans are hugely affected. And let me start with an interesting statistic. The ocean is, of course, home to marine life, but it also provides livelihoods to millions of people. And in fact, aquatic life makes up over 94% of all life on the planet. So while we thought that, we might be overpopulated here on land, there's a lot more life underwater. And there's more species, there's more diversity underwater than there is on land. And of course, one benefit is that I believe 70% of the air we breathe actually comes from marine plants. So really, the oceans are integral to our survival, but they are also being negatively impacted by climate change. So Yvonne, I'll bring you in here. I'd like you to explain to us the impact of climate change on marine ecosystems and coral reefs.
Thank you so much, Smriti. So like you said, the oceans are really a big part of our environment and quite neglected, because a lot of people don't get a chance to see what's happening underwater, and what you cannot see, often at times you cannot relate to. Climate change has been quite negatively impacting the oceans. At the moment, earlier this year, between March and April, we had the fourth mass bleaching of the coral reefs. And it's sad to say that I think we've lost more than 50% of the existing reefs that we already had. So from the NTV Wild Talk episode, it's gone down.
But let me interject, because there are a number of people who may not firstly understand the importance of coral reefs and what exactly coral bleaching means.
Okay, so That's true. Often at times, the marine space is not present in such forums, and we have to give people a bit of background. So coral reefs, I would essentially say they play the role that tropical forests play on land, and they support up to 25% of marine organisms. And 25% might look like an insignificant number, but it's quite a huge number. And in the reefs, these are the most productive areas of the ocean. So most of our fisheries is found within these reefs. Now, with the climate change, how it impacts the ocean, there's rising water temperatures and ocean acidification. Something that surprises a lot of people is that corals are actually animals and not rocks. So just as a caution, when you go to the ocean, don't pick up coral reefs and go to your home and decorate. That's a living organism. So with this acidification and increase in temperatures, the corals detach from their skeleton, which is calcium carbonate, and they detach and they die, and this is now what is called bleaching. So you find that when you watch Nat Geo Wild, which is where a lot of people interact with the ocean, the corals are quite colorful. And when you go to the ocean, you don't find this color so much, and you wonder, okay, what was I seeing on TV? Now, this color, corals coexist in a symbiotic relationship with an algae known as zooxanthellae. Sorry, not a lot of science, but the zooxanthellae is actually what gives the coral this color. Now, when the bleaching starts, when the temperatures get hot, the corals start to release the algae. And the algae, since it's a symbiotic relationship, they feed the corals. Now, with the algae being released, then there is no food for the corals, and the corals start to bleach. Now, this bleaching cascades to the small fish that depend on the corals, which cascade to the medium, larger fish, and in that regard. So we lose a whole ecosystem that consists of different organisms by just these coral reefs being bleached. So that in itself is a concern. And what I do where I work at Revolution, we undertake a coral reef restoration project.
And I will come to that.
Yeah.
But just to highlight that the coral reefs are so important because they provide a habitat. They are home to the smaller fish, right?
Yes.
That's where the smaller fish are. And if the coral is not there, the smaller fish won't be there. The bigger fish won't have smaller fish to feed on, and the bigger fish might not then exist, etc. So it has a long knock-on effect. So that is why coral reefs and ecosystems are critical. But what you're saying at this point, you were just mentioning, we visited you last year and we did an episode for NTV Wild Talk on the work that you did. And you are saying now that there has been a difference in the health of the coral ecosystems. What has happened and what has caused this?
So between March, we experienced really high temperatures globally. And the threshold for our corals here in Kenya is ideally 28 to 29 degrees Celsius. That's the maximum temperature that's optimal for them. But the waters got to 33 degrees Celsius, and in other areas, it got to even 34 degrees along our Kenyan coastline.
Wow.
So some of the corals are not even bleaching. They were straight up dying. Like, there was no in between. And in bleaching, sometimes corals can recover. But once they die and macroalgae takes over, we cannot really save them again. They cannot recover. So between March and April, the temperatures were really high, and this is a result of climate change, and it was a global effect. It was felt everywhere, and we've lost a really good percentage. So it's something that needs to be talked more about. And the fishermen that depend on these ecosystems for their fisheries are the people who get deeply impacted by such a scenario.
Okay. All right, we'll talk more about the work that's being done, but it is quite tragic to hear that because there is no reversal, although efforts are being made to restore, and like I said, we will come to that. All right, from the oceans, I want to go to the county of Baringo and bring you in here, Susan, as the CEO of the Baringo County Conservancies Association. I want to use Baringo as a case study, but also just to understand what is happening in that county, how the people and communities and wildlife and the landscapes are being affected by climate change. I brought you in from Baringo County because it is a county that is often in the news for reasons that aren't positive, banditry, attacks, and so on and so forth. But Baringo is absolutely beautiful. It is made up of vast landscapes, from the hills to the lakes and to conservancies as well. So bring us up to speed with what is happening in your county at this moment.
So thank you very much for the invitation and being part of this dialogue. I think it's very, very important sometimes to hear about, almost the forgotten lands. So I'm happy today to represent Baringo community. So I work for community. I work for Baringo County Conservancies Association, an initiative that was established by communities in 2017. And this was just to voice to have a collective voice, as well to be able to advocate for enabling policies, to be able to conserve biodiversity, their cultures, and also to be able to, seek for help with the issues that they normally suffer in terms of climate change. So as you say, Baringo really has been in the limelight with so much of negativity, and I would wish to give a number of reasons why it's so. So Baringo is quite diverse. The diversity of landscape, as Smirti has said. Two, we also have diverse cultures. It's a county that has 5 communities or 6 communities, and 3 of them are indigenous communities. The Endorois, the El Chamus, and there's also partly Ogiek within our Mau forest. So these are communities that have coexisted with nature for a long time, or from time immemorial, but there are other, external factors that are really affecting them, or let me say, not only external, but also it's good to understand what is going on there. So Baringo sits within the floor of the Rift Valley, and with all the geology that it has, it falls as a very vulnerable landscape for any changes within nature. Any significant change affects it because it stands at a very loose ground. So that is one of them. And from history, it was one of the most diverse ecosystem. That is from books written by David Anderson, talking about how the historic defaunation of Baringo. There's very, very good books on that. And Baringo used to be a site where, during those colonial periods, it was the major sites where you can feel by Africa and have real adventure. And that is the basis where sport hunting was in those times, and even the slave trade, ivory trade. And some of the evidences are about 164 trail, where, the slave trades and the ivory used to be taken. So there's evidence, and we've turned it up into a geotrail. So just to talk about the various impacts because of its fragility, based on its geology, is you've heard of rising water levels. Baringo has 4 freshwater, 4 lakes, rift lakes. One of them is Lake Baringo, about 270 kilometers square. We have Lake Bogoria, a salty lake, hosting millions of flamingos. And we also have Lake 94, a lake that, let me say, got established because of the separation of waters between Lake Bogoria and Baringo, and there is also Lake Kapnarok. So the issues of climate change are very real. We have rising water levels that have really, displaced wildlife, displaced even the fauna, the trees, displaced homes or livelihoods. Something else is drought, is a major issue, which really has caused a lot of issues in terms of human-wildlife conflicts, continued degradation or loss of ground cover that really pushes, people beyond. And that's why those are the issues that have really exacerbated the issues of banditry, cattle rustling, intercommunity conflicts, which is majorly resource conflict. It's about grass and water, which are 2 parameters that are that climate change hit heavily. So those are the major issues. We have landslides in the upper areas. And with all that, according to our communities, is
climate change is not very new. Some of those occurrences happened, but they happened in seasonalities, and the intensity is not the way it is. So traditionally, there were ways they used to manage such issues. But you see, like the conservancies that we have in Baringo, there are about 16. Most of those conservancies were set aside land because they were not inhabitable areas. They were closed out areas where no settlement was allowed. So that was one of the traditional ways in which that community used to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Okay. But now, with increase of population, other competing land, other external issues, now the interplay is felt heavily.
Okay, thank you. We will come to some of the innovative solutions. There is hope for Baringo. We'll touch on that shortly. All right, Henry, thank you for your patience. Now, we've heard some of the real-life stories from people on the ground. But as my boss always reminds us, Monica, that's you, it is about the data. It is about the science. It is about the research. What is it telling us from your perspective as a research associate? Henry, what is the research telling us about the real impacts of climate change on biodiversity?
Thank you so much, Dmitry. And I must appreciate that being Earthwise, and I want to ride on what Nancy and Musyoki talked about, connectivity, of landscapes. So even before I come to research and its place in this discussion, I think we all have to acknowledge that marine, terrestrial, all these landscapes are connected. So I believe even as science positions itself in this space, we need to acknowledge that connectivity bit. Into the discussion of today, what is the science telling us? And if we contextualize this in the climate, space, we've seen, assessment. We look at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that just does the assessment on the state of knowledge. So in Africa, we have the science. The science is telling us that if we don't utilize science and evidence that we produce, especially in decision making, we are not likely to get where we want to be. And I like the work that Adaptation Consortium is doing with communities. And we are moving from a space where science was a preserve of disciplines. So we've democratized science in a way that everybody should be part and parcel of this process. And science has been made more open in the sense that now we have no excuse in terms of making decisions that are not based on evidence. So in the nexus of climate change, biodiversity conservation, and people, the science is very robust that we need to embrace the connectivity. If we treat climate change, or if we treat biodiversity on its own, without looking at the integrated sort of approach in terms of assessment, in terms of risks, climate risks to these particular landscapes, we are not doing well. So, the future is good in terms of the outlook, but if we don't utilize the evidence that we are generating from the ground up, with different partners, with different assessments that we are doing, then we are going back to the silo mentality, where science, policymakers, practitioners, we were all disjointed. So the message that is coming from different assessments that we've done, nationally, at African level, globally, that science has to embed itself into policy-making space. And it is a challenge to both. It's a call to action, not just researchers or scientists. Sometimes we've been accused that we do research without, getting ourselves out there to explain what we do. I know it's been accused a lot in terms of just sitting down in silos. But I think we are changing. The space is changing, that universities, conservation institutions, governments are able to sit together and share, in terms of scientific evidence that we are getting from these assessments. How can we embed them in decision making? So I think that's important. And lastly is Nancy talked about a very important issue, conservation as a viable land use. If we are to make conservation as a viable land use, we have to go back to the evidence. How do we, plug in what is the state and trends telling us about different land use changes? How is the future looking like? So those kind of approaches that actually are scientific in nature, but then how do we do this particular research? It's about the model, so opening up the space and being able to allow science to, embed itself with policy and practice is actually key in this case.
Would you say we are making progress? Are we on the right track in achieving that, or are we lagging behind?
We must admit, I think this is a very honest discussion we're having. We don't have deficiency in terms of evidence. What we are lacking is uptake of evidence in policy making. The progress in terms of science is quite well in terms of research, adaptation research. It's quite diverse, going from the ground up, diverse spaces. But until we engage with government, politicians, practitioners on the ground, I think if we don't do that, we still go back to the point where science is done for the sake of it, or research is for the sake of it, but not for the sake of impact that we need to have on the ground.
Okay. Thank you, Henry. Yvonne, based on science and evidence and research, Reefolution came up with an innovative way of trying to restore coral ecosystems. Now, this is part of the solution. When we talk about the theme, innovation and resilience, let's now delve deeper into the ocean and explain to us the work that Reefolution has undertaken and how it's working to improve coral reefs and therefore livelihoods.
Thank you. So at Reefolution, our work is divided into 4 pillars. We have the coral restoration, which is our main objective. But like he said, science is very important, especially in relation to climate change as our biggest threat to coral reefs. So we have a very big component on research, and we're trying to kind of find, heat resilience in corals so that we can use the heat resilient corals for the restoration. And then we have an education and awareness component. For the education and awareness, the idea is to have this knowledge transferred to the people that we work with, to the younger generation, so that we can encourage behavior change. Now, how we do the restoration is through a process called the coral gardening. In coral gardening, we dive underwater, we collect corals of opportunities. These are corals that have broken off the natural colony due to natural causes, or sometimes boat anchoring and other ways. And then we outplant them to nursery trees. We fragment them because corals produce sexually and asexually. So we fragment them to sizes this small. I have to give reference, this small. And we put them in the nursery trees. And we leave them in the nursery trees for 6 months up to 1 year. We currently work with branching corals, but there are different types of corals. So we leave them 6 months up to 1 year, and depending on the different species, by the end of 1 year, from this size, it becomes this big. We then take it and put it in an artificial reef. We call it an artificial reef because corals need a hard substrate to attach to. And in the area we're working, the cause of the degradation, apart from climate change, there was unsustainable fishing practices in the past, but also there was a bleaching event in the 1970s that cleared out most of our corals. So it's rubble, and we create these artificial reefs from locally available materials. The nursery trees are made from PVC pipes. The artificial structures are made from cement and glass bottles, and other structures we just use metal rebars. Then we have to plant them on these artificial structures, and after the outplanting, we leave them to interact with the ecosystem, because we do it where there is a natural reef. It's very important to have a natural reef because we want to mimic the natural reef as possible, and it encourages the complexity in biodiversity in the area that we do the restoration.
And how is that working? I mean, I would really encourage you to log on to our website and watch that episode where we covered Reefolution on NTV Wild Talk. It was fascinating to have the opportunity to go underwater and literally see them creating a coral garden and how it works. And we actually managed to now see from that artificial reef and that ecosystem fish and octopus coming back and using that as now their new habitat.
Yes. So we have different structures of the artificial reef. This structural complexity, it's to encourage different types of organisms to come in. We find turtles resting on these artificial reefs, octopuses, like you've mentioned. When we started, it's important to mention that the Revolution project is in collaboration with Mkwiro Beach Management Unit. And this is a community-based organization that is mandated by the government to take care of the area, the ocean area in front of their village. So with the Mkwiro community, when we started the partnership, the idea was to get to 0.8 hectares of restored area. This would enable the reef to kind of restore naturally afterwards. But at the moment, we are at 5,400 meters squared. That is 0.5 hectares that has been restored. And this was earlier in the year. Like I said, the bleaching has happened. We're still monitoring the impacts of the bleaching. It would take us a bit back. And for these corals to come back again, it takes a bit 2 to 3 years. We are hoping that it will come back, but we've not done the evaluation of the impact of the bleaching at the moment. The restoration has been going on quite well. There's community support, there's government support. So yeah, we just have to wait and see.
How sustainable is this project, and has it been? Are we seeing it in other areas along the coastline as well? It is obviously not ideal to try and restore ecosystems, but it is incredible if we have to do that, that it is possible and it can work.
On this aspect of sustainability, like I mentioned, research is a really big component, and we are partnering. Our main research partner is Wageningen University in the Netherlands, but also Pani University. We are currently genotyping the corals to find out what specific genes make them more resilient, because we want to really have resilient corals in our oceans. We also have active experiments that expose the corals to higher temperatures. We have a depth gradients. We put them at different depths to kind of see how they interact with the light and the heat. And some of the corals get exposed during low tide just to see if this makes them more resilient. So in a sense, we are creating resilience in these corals to encourage sustainability. The restoration is quite not so common, because we also have another community group just next to where we're working, the Wasini Beach Management Unit, that have a coral restoration project that has been quite a success, honestly, and the biodiversity in that area can only be compared to Kisite Mpunguti, that's the marine park after that. And then up north, we also have 2 more projects that are upcoming and are diving into the coral reef restoration. So for sustainability, research is really, really a key component.
Okay, yeah. It is indeed a very innovative project. Okay, Susan, I'll come back to you now. And another interesting fact is that now 65% of Kenya's wildlife, I think I'm right, Charles, actually lives out of the parks. They live in community or private lands. And there is so much pressure on this wildlife for numerous reasons. Infrastructure development, population growth, human-wildlife conflict, and of course, climate change. But conservancies, now that is different from a reserve and a national park. And Susan, you'll tell us more about this, but conservancies offer hope in terms of protecting wildlife. They are part of the solution. I'd like you to explain to us how. How do conservancies work? You are the CEO of the Baringo County Conservancies Association over there, and what are some of the challenges?
So thank you very much. I think I would draw my maybe response from what my colleague Musyoki talked about, whereby climate change has pushed wildlife outside protected areas. There is no more land for wildlife that is within the protected area. So because of that, communities that have this wildlife came up they came up, and one of the solutions was to establish a conservancy. The model was initiated many years ago in the 80s in the Southern Africa, Namibia, South Africa, the southern countries. And I think it proved as a model that communities can participate in wildlife conservation and complement the work of the government in really trying to provide habitat, and for the habitat and the wildlife to continue providing the ecosystem services. As you heard from my colleague, that there are so many benefits that we get from wildlife. And when we talk about wildlife, we don't talk only about the four-legged animals. It's not about the big ones. It's the big ones, the ones that have no legs, the insects, the ones that live in the sea.
And don't
so we are
forget
talking
the
about all of
birds,
them. Yes, and the birds.
Because in Baringo,
Yeah.
there are thousands of birds.
Yes. So each creation, let me say, each creation by God really has a significance. And as human beings, we really have a right of use, but also a duty to protect. So out of all those maybe issues, communities developed conservancies, and conservancies are really land that a private owner or a community can decide to have it for conservation. And
So
conservation
let me
as a
interject.
land use.
So that land belongs to the communities. It is their land, and they choose to give it up for conservation.
Yes. So there are two types of land ownerships. Conservancies. You can give your own land to do conservation. This is because maybe you're next to a park, wildlife come, or there are wildlife, birds, insects, and you need that coexistence. So we have the private ones, and we have also group private, whereby a number of community members or individuals agree to join up their land for co-management or for communal management, but ownership is different. Then the third one is where community is owned communally. So we have three models in Kenya, and I think out of all that, so conservancies provide 12.8% of land under conservation in Kenya, while protected area is currently 8%. So what does this call for? We work with support from KWS. We work closely with KWS and the counties where those conservancies are in terms of collaboratively working towards conserving the natural capital, because they are also natural heritage. So other than the ecosystem services, they also provide the natural capital. And that's why we are talking about carbon credit. We are talking about water. Those are big water towers that really provide water for our urban areas. And I think sometimes it's time to talk about, the ecosystem services that we get from the natural areas. Because if we don't value them, then we don't invest in them. So they are no more. So conservancies are really models that communities or individuals objectively and strategically develop them, whereby they come with land use plans. We map the natural resources that are there. Then we try to create a plan where we can optimize each resource to be able to either give income or provide a service for a certain purpose. So at the end of the day, we look at the needs, we look at the opportunities that are there, and then we optimize. So I think that is one way that we can do, because I know Kenya, land is really a very emotive maybe issue. And we have lands, and there are people who have lands that are not in use. And if you go to developed countries, such lands are given to government, then you're given incentive as an individual or a tax relief for you to continue conserving. So in Kenya, those are the things that we are looking at in such a way that land conservation can be optimized to give direct benefits to the owners. Land can be optimized to give natural benefits to us, and also even for export. So there are so many opportunities that we've missed out, and the model really brings it up. So you can have the model in your home, in your farm, or you can join in and optimize your production. Yeah.
Susan, my question would be, how well is this model working? Because the aim is to conserve the wildlife, but the communities are also expecting to reap benefits. They're not just giving up their land for free and saying, all right, it's for the wildlife. They are expecting to benefit from giving up their land. Is this really happening? Where are some of the challenges, as much as this is a solution?
So thank you very much. I would wish to say that, Kenya Wildlife Service, through a regulation, the Conservancies Regulation of 2015, has instituted that model. So it's already instituted in 2015. And in Kenya, so it provides a blueprint. So in Kenya, with the blueprint, each area or each community has adopted the blueprint and modeled based on the resources they have. So one of the most successful conservancies model is the Mara. Mara is individual owners owning 100 to 150 or whatever, 50 to 150 acres have joined up to form group private conservancies. I think they're about 26. So they lease the land. So one of the opportunities they reap is wildlife conservation. And that provides them with pasture for their livestock. So they have well-planned livestock projects. Secondly, they also have investors, tourism investors, whereby they get income per year on annual basis. And that to me has been successful. Because if you talk about Kenya today, you talk about the Maasai brand. You talk about tourism in Maasai. So out of the community conservancy model, Maasai is now Kenya, and Kenya is Maasai. So what happens to the other communities? We need to look at what opportunities we have in such models. So for Baringo, we have a different model, whereby we have a mix of private, community, and group private. And in all of them, they have their own uniqueness because of the diversity that we have. So we have some that have hotels, some that do adventure tourism. And I think Baringo used to be really one of the destinations some years ago, which we are now trying to bring it back through various concepts. And one of the concepts, merging biodiversity and the landscapes that we have, is a concept called Geopark, which may be given an opportunity, I'll be able to share more.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've touched on an innovative solution. We've touched on a land use solution. Now I want to come to a people-based solution. Kenya Wildlife Service, you have no choice but to work very closely with communities, with the people who live side by side with wildlife. Communities play a big role in conservation. On one hand, we have the issue of, yes, human-wildlife conflict. But on the other hand, we have a situation where communities cannot be alienated because they are at the forefront. So, Charles, my question to you is, how does the Kenya Wildlife Service integrate local communities into wildlife conservation, taking advantage or onboarding their traditional knowledge, their experiences, and their expertise to address climate change issues?
Okay, thank you very much, Spriti. I think you've put it very well. I think the people of Kenya, something that is probably lost is that the wildlife in this country is owned by the people of Kenya. What KWS does is to manage it on their behalf. So in so doing, then it becomes important that we engage the people. So from time to time, we do engage with them just to find out whether we are on the right course in terms of taking care of their wildlife. And so in carrying out most of the conservation programs that we do, the public becomes a very important segment in it all, because the success or failure of conservation in this country largely depends on how the public perceives that resource. And so I must say one of the most successful areas that we've been able to get involved in is public awareness creation, enabling the public to really understand the role of wildlife in their livelihoods, enabling the public to really understand how they can participate in wildlife conservation and benefit from it. And also making them aware what role wildlife plays in this country. And so one of the things that we have been very keen on right from the time of inception of conservation in this country is really running awareness campaigns across the country. We have a very vibrant conservation education outfit within KWS that reaches out to the public on a regular basis to really educate them, empower them with emerging technologies and information about conservation. And indeed, the whole area of conservancy development is as a result of this. One of the interventions that we are carrying out in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation is the creation of new nature reserves. We find it extremely difficult to create new national parks and new national reserves because of the nature of the process. However, we have found a very good avenue through the wildlife conservancies. And that is why today, as a result of that awareness creation, this country has more wildlife conservancies than national parks and national reserves combined. And as a result of that, we are seeing more and more communities coming up and wanting to set up conservancies on their parcels of land so that they can be able then to benefit from the conservation of this wildlife. Secondly, restoration is very key. I've listened to Yvonne very carefully when she talked about the coral reefs. But on terrestrial land, the one way of dealing with the effects of climate change is through restoration. We know all the areas that are degraded, both within the protected areas, within the conservancies, and also outside of such areas. So restoration programs are very key. Replanting, reseeding, re-establishing grasslands, re-establishing shrublands, and so on, becomes a very key consideration in climate change adaptation. Reforestation is also key. We are involving a lot of our communities in growing trees, planting trees, and ensuring that we are able to nurture these trees until we re-establish forests. Countries that have large proportions of their territory on forests are better equipped to deal with the effects of climate change. We've seen countries where forest cover is almost 70% of the territory. Those countries do not really feel the effects of climate change as much as we do here, where our forest cover is quite low. So we need to aim as a country to increase our forest cover. We need to aim to ensure that natural grasslands are restored, natural shrublands are also restored, so that our environment then is better prepared to deal with the ravages of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So people really do have a big role to play. They are part of the solution. Now, my next point is a solution/challenge, Nancy, and it is funding. Because for a lot of this to work, funding is required, whether it is to implement projects or to use as incentives for communities. From where you sit, what are some of the innovative funding mechanisms that perhaps can be established to enhance biodiversity conservation?
Thank you very much. And allow me, before I respond to that question, just to pose the challenge to us as we sit here and the listeners. Listening to Yvonne talk about restoration of corals, you get lost. We take something small, we put it in an artificial something. Great work. But can you imagine if we had only conserved and didn't have to put in resources to do the restoration?
Exactly.
And I think it's the question that was posed yesterday by the professor who was talking about Nairobi River. I'm not opposed to that, but I hear we have 20,000 young people who will benefit from cleaning the river, quote and unquote. We said the river, you cannot clean it. Water, you cannot clean water. Water cleans, so it can only self-cleanse. But supposing 10% of that group was actually to ensure that people do not pollute the water. Let it be. So we don't need to clean it, but we just need to let it be. So if we could conserve and put more resources in conservation, it would actually save a lot of resources on restoration, which is a very expensive undertaking. And I say we sit on a crime scene. Most of us here, like myself, who is above 35, and who can only benefit from social fund. Anyone who is above 35, I think it's a crime scene because we've messed the waters, we've messed the land, and now we are looking at how can we restore for the generations that have had nothing to do with this. And then we shall leave them the big work of doing the work that Yvonne is doing, and then we are left wondering how can we even scale it up. That is the question I have. Great work, Yvonne. I am saying that. And for the same for Nairobi, Smriti, by the time we start saying, and those who have been in this city for long, a number of years ago, maybe 10 plus, we could only do 200 meters and you hit borehole, an aquifer that has water. Today, if you want to be licensed or to get a permit to do a borehole, you need to do 500 meters plus to get water. It might have been easier to safeguard the catchment, the Ngong, the Nairobi Park, any other park, you know, as opposed to looking at a future where we shall start recharging boreholes, you know, digging wells to recharge the aquifers. And that is where we should be heading. Anyhow, that said, the resources for conservation are not, I think we are struggling in that space. I wanted to hear from Susan. Susan has painted a very good picture, and I want to say the picture is not like that, Susan. And you and I know. And I'm sure Prof knows, he'll not say it. But we are looking at conservancies and have said it's a good model. But a few years ago, maybe it was paying because a father had 150 acres of land. So if you have an investor and they pay, then that household has some income. That father has now 4 wives and 10 sons who are still looking at the 150 acres of land. So however much money you put in that investment of tourism investors, it's not going to sustain conservation. We need to be honest. Maybe it's an answer now, stopgap measure, but looking forward, that will not sustain it. And the question that we shall be asked where financing is coming in is if a farmer in central Kenya is doing tea and another one is doing wheat, why won't an elephant on my land pay to also survive? You know, who is supposed to take that burden? It's a question and a discussion between us and Musyoki. Because, you know, we hear, and occasionally we'll hear politically, debts have been cleared for Mount Kenya, debts have been cleared for sugarcane farmers. I don't know whether the debts are cleared for the wildlife keepers, but we need to start engaging on where that funding will come from. And critically, our own funding, starting from ourselves. We talk of I don't know, is it the Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife or Wildlife and Tourism? I think the order is important. The resource itself, the wildlife. So this wildlife is here for Kenyans and also for the world. So we need to invest in it. It is our resource. That is what we sell when we sell Kenya, when we say Tembea Kenya, when we say Magical Kenya. What we are actually selling, almost 80% of that is that wildlife. And therefore, we need to invest because that is what we are picking from. That is an investment that we need to invest in. And it shouldn't be left to communities, you know, to put their land together and gain some income from it. It is an investment. The same way we invest for the water towers should be the same way, and I think we invest for the wildlife work. So our own investments. And then look at, you know, other mechanisms. So we often talk about payment for ecosystem services. And probably, you know, amongst the many levies that you have on your power bill, which are usually 70% or 60 or 50 of the bill, there is usually some bill for water catchment management. But the question again is how much of that gets back to the catchment protection. Okay. So we need that resource, again, coming from ourselves in terms of payment for ecosystem services, because if we have no water, then even the businesses we do will not survive. If the Tsavo National Park does not safeguard that ecosystem, the Mzima Springs, so Mombasa actually would need to start paying for the conservation of the upstream space. And Nairobi would need to pay for Aberdare, we would need to pay for Mount Kenya, and the Mara and Cherangani. Yeah. And then maybe a third one is investments, because we are saying these lands will not remain like that. Again, we have to think outside. So impact investors, where the private sector then comes in. The private sector thrives because of bottom lines. And I am not the best person to talk about this. Madam there can talk about that. However, if it makes business sense to do conservation, people are going to invest. Companies will invest. So that is what we need to unlock.
Thank
even
you.
as we look at carbon and biodiversity credits. I don't want to get into those, but our own,
Thank you,
own
Nancy.
solutions, yes.
Thank you so much. Henry, I'll bring you here, and I am under extreme pressure to, unfortunately, wrap up this conversation. But I need to ask you the next question. Of course, we are where we are. It is what it is. So we need to look at, of course, innovative solutions, which we have been doing, financing, of course, working with communities. But I want us to talk about adaptation. From where you sit, based on research perhaps, what are some of the adaptation strategies that we can onboard to turn things around and to also build resilience amongst communities?
Thank you. Allow me in a few seconds to just comment on what Nancy and Susanna have talked about. What pays is what stays. So if we don't, ask ourselves, how do we expand some of these wildlife economy models, we are not going to make it. There are a lot of opportunities that we need to leverage on these particular areas. So I think that discussion, Nancy, I agree, it could be taken further than that. But back to your question about adaptation, what adaptation strategies are viable, or do we want to look at in the sense that as we adapt to impacts? And I think I was listening to the presentation by Kennedy in terms of adaptation that is driven from the bottom up, from the ground up, So the strategies that will be viable in the next, if you take this last decade, 2030, we need locally led adaptation initiatives. And there's a lot of issues around that, and referring to the 8 principles of locally led adaptation strategies. And some of them are quite clear. We need to be very, very, very clear in terms of what we need. Participation. So adaptation strategies are not just strategies. We need to ask ourselves, are they inclusive? Are they serving us all? Like, do they carry all of us forward? So if we stay with the fact that we need to adapt to impacts of climate change, and we talk about biodiversity, people, connectivity or connection, we need to be very, very clear in terms of local, homegrown solutions. We don't have to fetch adaptation strategies from elsewhere. Of course, we can carry lessons from other contexts, but do we want to talk about contextualization of these strategies? So if you ask me, I would say the viable strategies that would work for us as Kenyans or Africans are those that, number one, are participatory in nature. We cannot just walk into a context and propose solutions that do not work for those particular areas. You've heard of the Masu area. Allow communities to co-create, and those strategies are likely to be viable and sustainable in the long run. Number two is about low cost, and low cost doesn't mean cheap. Just need to be very cost effective, in the sense that as we look at strategies that can work for us, we are cost conscious about, are they likely to be adopted, by context that we propose them to work in. And number three is about equity. We cannot talk about adaptation to impacts of climate change if people don't benefit. So, and I'm happy that we are talking about Earthwise, and some actually equate it to opportunities. So the discussion about climate adaptation, let us ask ourselves, where are the opportunities positioned, and how can we talk about strategies that can also deliver multiple benefits to the people? So the multiplier effect, I cannot just come up with a strategy or an option that does not have multiplier benefits, co-benefits to biodiversity, to economy. Government will ask you, how are we benefiting, for them to buy in?
Right.
So we need to be very strategic in terms of how we align all this and carry all of us forward. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, because that indeed is the direction we need to head in. There is still so much more to talk about. I have pleaded for extra time, but I've been told no. I'm otherwise eating into the tea break. So I will say thank you so much, but if you have any more questions for this panel, please do stay till the end of the day, because there will be a Q&A session, I believe. But Charles, Nancy, Susan, Henry, and Yvonne, thank you so much for your great insights into this important conversation. Much appreciated. Please let's give them a round of applause.
All right, thank you very much, Smriti. And I totally understand. There's so much to discuss, but again, very